Hey everyone, my name is Charles Lee. I'll be doing a vehicle demo today. Every time I design either characters or vehicle or props, even environments, for me it's very important to start with these factors. Here you can see 15 to 20 words. It reminds me what type of the style I need to actually implement. If you look at the words on the right bottom, those are like more in terms of the functionality, like hovering, walker or carrier or like assault. They can help you solidify your design towards the end. And also another type of words I always want to put it there is a sci-fi, steampunk, and then fantasy. So when it gets to the reference research stage, these words comes in really handy. I try not to start with, the perspective lines or, even like the details. I always start with a very simple geometric shapes: circle, square, triangle. There are only 3 types of lines I'm using: straight lines, C-curve, and then the other one is the S-curves. So these are like a little more obvious when it gets down to some of the really rough samples I brought here. Most of these vehicles consist of like these 3 lines, and not just the shape of lines, but also consist of like the 3 different thickness. Once you start trying to combine these 3 different lines, along with the basic shapes here, you have to think about these 3 things. So one is the weight distribution, second is the line weights, and then third is the simple versus frequency. If you look at some of the thumbnails on the left top corner, they're really simple. I started them with a basic circle here, and then the really thick lines that indicates the shadow, and then some of the medium lines to define the silhouette itself. Okay, I'm going to start with a whimsical and beefy, and then something cute, right? So I probably don't go to, these kind of functional words like defensive or hover or those yet, right? So I start with like in a basic circle shape. And then one thing I'm thinking about here is, like I was explaining here, the weight distribution. So if I start with this basic circle shape, I try not to incorporate another same size of the shape like this. So the problem is, like, once you start adding 2 shapes that are too similar in terms of the size, the weight distribution, it really like breaks. You always start with the shape that is a lot smaller. I start with something like this, and then probably another shape like that big. So as you can see, these 3 shapes, they have like really distinctive different sizes. You look at like a lot of these different thumbnails here, basically it was all done the same way. So for example, like, this one here. So I was like trying to think, okay, there's like a cockpit, right? This is where the person can sit in. The next one I'll try to add is like, I try to put like something really big. And then what you can also think about is, the line quality. So if I try to have like the 2 similar lines everywhere, it makes the design really flat. So I really recommend you do a lot of thumbnails. And then here's another circle, and I add another small elements here. So again, our eye rests here for a while, and then it travels back to these smaller objects. So I keep doing these shape studies until I have something I really like.
No matter what you want to design, you don't want to stop at your first idea. And Dave Greco's character concept course can help you get the most out of your design process. And the digital fundamentals course can lay the groundwork. You can find them and a growing list of other amazing courses over at proko.com/store. And right now, during the 12 days of Proko, you can save 15% on all Proko original courses until January 1st.
Another one, I try not to put the same size shape in the circles. I always try to focus on the different shapes. Let's try some square as well. Anything you draw, they have to consist of like different shape of objects. Just also notice that like how I try to keep everything very rough and loose as well. So nothing should be detailed or like a tight design, especially in this stage. I'm not a huge fan of using perspective lines, especially in the beginning. In this stage, I try to figure out like the main shape of the vehicle. And then at this point, like once I like, certain silhouettes, if you look at this one, for example, like we can turn this into either sci-fi or like fantasy or like the steampunk, right? If I really like this one, I can do another backside of it.
Is this the same process that you use if you're drawing for yourself, for casual purposes, as well as for professional work?
When you work on the project, usually like, the script is already there, and then they explain like what kind of vehicle you have to design, like the train, right? But you can still like come up with, some of the ideas like this, and then you can try to still push more of the adjectives. So for example, like one of the vehicles we designed at Arcane was the monocycle. So that one was It's already there. Like if you search up for like the motorcycle during like the Victorian era, the shape is already there. So all we have to do was now add more like Victorian details as well as the Zan detail, which is the Gothic and those elements, right? So add a little bit more of the personality to it, right? So for example, like this one, you don't know that's a sci-fi or steampunk or even fantasy, right? You can easily like turn it into all this different genre. What's really important is up to this point, all this silhouette you design here is something you really like. So next part, when I do the details of it, I usually like take, let's say like, stuff like this. It's super tiny. So I bring it here. So the cool thing about this technique is now I don't have to change the silhouette or anything because like, okay, I'm committed to, not 100%, but at least I'm committed like 80% to this design. This is where like the research part comes in. So let's say if I want to make this more like a steampunk, obviously if you want to turn this vehicle into sci-fi, then your reference should be different. I have all this detail like in the realistic parts. I'm going to start incorporate this into the vehicle. Also, the one thing I mentioned here was the distribution of simple and frequency. All these areas I consider as a simple. And this area is where I register as the detail area, right? Like the frequency. For me, it's like not just the vehicle design, but the prop design, character design. This most important thing is, the simple versus the detail. So if I keep this area simple, I know for sure this is where all the details gonna go, and probably some here. So I might change things a little bit back here, but at this point, I'm going to focus on the frequency area, which is the functional part. So also the trick here is you don't like really carbon copy exactly what the image is. It's more like you have to filter out that like what you need from the image to implement into your vehicle design. So for example, like, okay, if I'm going to use like this part right here, what I really like about this part is, this detail right there. And then probably something like this. So now I'm going to process like, okay, how am I gonna implement this detail right here? So I already have like something similar here. So I'm going to start designing. I think this process is really helpful because when you're focusing on the silhouette, that's more like, the artistic part. So what's like the prettiest silhouette that I can get, then you're implementing the function into it.
Are you more focused on how backed up your design is by like real life science? Or if it's just a cool design and it doesn't really make sense, you'll do it?
From the experience, it's always whatever the cool thing is. After all, like what we're trying to do here is it's not like real functional thing. We're trying to create, the concept art. This kind of like a cog here and this functionality here, I think it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to implement that a little bit here. So one technique I also like to use a lot is this positive and negative shapes. And then negative is more into this kind of dark black, the shadow areas to create like really interesting pattern and shape there. The empty areas, it's more about the texturing and, like the maybe decaling and stuff like that. But every time when there's the big shapes actually joining the other shapes, that's where like the design happens. So the worst thing is, you can just leave there like with just kind of joint like that. One really interesting function I can see here is right there. So I'm going to think about how I can add this functionality to here. So it's got to be something like this, that piston movement, right? That's what I'm going to add here. I'm going to give like the indentation there.
Since you're working off your reference for this connection of the two pieces here, did you pick your reference before you already had this design in your mind?
Yeah. These are all like pre-picked. More experienced you are, you use more reference. And then, the less experienced you are, actually, like you only have like 2-3 reference. And then you kind of, if you're stuck, you kind of stop. So all the experience I had, even when I was at the Riot or the Blizzard, if you look at, these amazing, like the artists you work with, when you look at their screen, whatever they work on is in the center. And then they open up, like all these like other artists like they're inspired by. They have like 8 to 9 different images like that. So they can get constantly inspired by it. That's one category, right? And then second category is that you have to have like the realistic photo reference like this. And then the other one is like, the reference from the movies and animation that you like. So those 3 references should be surrounding your, like the image that you're working with. All the great artists, like, just it's the same way. They always work that way. My silhouette got a little bit different, but it doesn't really matter. So even though you make a conviction to this silhouette, it's not absolute. Like, you can always like change things a little bit after. But it's important to have this in the beginning so you can apply like a different functionality after. So Usually the opposite side I just indicate as the silhouette or the shadow. And it was like a thumbnail stage. It's kind of hard to see where I can put a lot of details. But once you zoom in, then you'll see like the more areas you can actually implement more details, right? So for example, like when you have choices like this, you never want to add another detail like, these areas, right? Because it's so close to the areas you just add a detail, right? So you want to leave all this area as simple as possible. And then another areas I can put detail is this part right here, because it's also, there's another platform's going to be attached to here. So I'm going to add another detail here. So I realized my perspective's a little wrong in the initial sketch of the person. I'm going to fix that. So what I think is also really interesting is some of the pistons right there. So I'll probably like bring that in as some kind of like a booster. I'll probably put some character here. I'm gonna do too much detail, like just gonna do an indication of a figure there. So again, this one was earlier, more like a walker type. Again, same process. So those like all the steampunk coggear in the reference. So we can start implementing those. So this is like some kind of walker from stylized project. So also like it's really convenient technique to use these thick lines and shadows and then the lights simultaneously. It's another good area to add more details is this area right here. So yeah, I'll probably use that. So when you look at it, like you can kind of like tell like what kind of like functionality there is, spinning or like it's something kind of like a movable that the functionality actually requires there. So when I look at these pre-collected steampunk reference, this is what I'm going to add. Since I don't have to draw the whole thing, I can just indicate quickly there. So it'll be inside, so you can actually address like a lot more details here, or you can actually edit as just a shadow. Just for the time being, I'll just edit them as shadows here. Then this is where the cockpit is. So there could be another function going here. I remember seeing this detail right here. That's what I'm adding it here. And maybe this black area is like a cushion. And I can always control my perspective here. Yeah, so there are actually like 2 more steps after this. Obviously there's a rendering, and then also there's like the stage that like I check the perspective and then add the textures and stuff like that. But those 2 processes like not as important as like these first 2. So I think the most important thing is how you start with your thumbnails, right? To come up with like the limitation with your own words. Eventually you'll take these to the color final.
Learn more from Charles Lee at kazoneart.com. And if you want to enhance your digital art skills, be sure to check out our digital painting fundamentals course at proko.com/digital painting, where you can learn from artists like Marco Bucci, Bryce Coe, Tiffany Mang, and more. The Digital Fundamentals course, along with all Proko original courses, are on sale right now during the 12 Days of Proko, so go save 15% until January 1st.